Robert Schumann has been dead a full century, and still today he remains a focus of controversy. People find themselves full of opinions about the worth of his music, about whether he deserves to rank in the great succession that followed Beethoven, about the relation between his romanticism and his ultimate insanity, about his legendary inability to orchestrate well, about his incompetence to deal with the symphonic form, and so on and on. Schumann is one of those special tastes that can send casual shipboard acquaintances rushing into each other's arms, or can make enemies of otherwise loving friends. But nobody will deny Schumann's great gifts, the inspired lyricism that soars out of his best works, the uncanny stream of newnesses that succeed each other in such profusion, the warmth, the singing tides, the rhythmic ingenuities, and the daring experimentalism. Still, one criticism remains that is shared by so many critics and musicians and simple music lovers that it should be looked into with some care, and that is the charge that Schumann was a bad orchestrator. This charge is so widely held to be true that I hesitate to be so bold as to re-examine it, yet perhaps by looking at the music and listening, we may see that the charge is greatly exaggerated, and at the same time we may learn something of what good orchestration really means. Well, first let's decide what orchestration means. It is simply the setting of music for orchestra, the mating of notes with their most suitable instrumental colors. In other words, it is an orchestral synonym for instrumentation. Well, what is instrumentation? If you are writing a piece for a sextet, let's say, consisting of piano, clarinet, 2 violins, a viola, and a cello, then you must decide which notes go to what instrument, who will play the melodies, and who the accompaniments and the counterpoints, how these instruments are going to blend together, whether the clarinet or the viola would be the better choice for a particular tune, whether the cello should accompany pizzicato or bowed, how to keep the piano from drowning out the strings. All that is instrumentation. On a larger scale, it becomes orchestration, the solution of those same problems, but in terms of a symphony orchestra, which can involve 100-odd men and infinite variety. This would naturally seem to be a harder job. There are more balances to make, more choices, requiring a greater capacity to juggle all these possible sounds. And yet, in some ways, it's easier. It's actually hard not to write well for orchestra, since the very bigness of the sounding body can cover up a multitude of sins. What then do we mean by a good orchestrator? We mean one who uses the orchestra for the most intense and direct expression of his musical thought. Much, of course, depends on the value of his musical thought to begin with. We always say that Berlioz was a great orchestrator, and we say the same of Rimsky-Korsakov. But if we are speaking of those works of theirs which are not intrinsically of much musical worth, then we cannot mean what we say. For if the music is not first class, no amount of brilliant or beautiful orchestration can save it or have any meaning of its own. It is then only fancy hackwork. By this definition, therefore, Beethoven was a great orchestrator, even though he's usually not singled out for this special gift, but he was because he used the powers of orchestral combinations to tell his music more clearly, and for no other separate or superficial purpose. To my mind, Schumann follows in this tradition. Like Beethoven, he regarded the orchestra as a means and not an end. It may be because of this that he fell into traps or came up against orchestral problems that he never solved. That's why so many conductors have felt free to make so-called versions of the 4 Schumann symphonies. At one point, it became almost a conductor's duty to rearrange Schumann's orchestration so that it would sound richer and fuller and more like orchestration of a later day. Many of these same conductors have done the same with passages in Beethoven's symphonies on the same grounds, although to a far slighter degree. One doesn't so easily tamper with the great god Beethoven. But with poor old Schumann, everyone seems to have the license to tamper as he pleases. In fact, it has become almost traditional to do so. In the recording of the Second Symphony, which accompanies this record, You will hear no tampering, nothing but the notes Schumann wrote, played by the instruments for which he wrote them. Not even the all-too-common device of doubling the woodwind parts has been employed. That is, the use of 4 flutes when Schumann called for 2, and so on down the line, a device intended to give greater power and richness to the wind body. But why should this doubling be necessary? After all, as you can hear, the woodwinds in simple pairs are perfectly audible throughout, and just as rich as Schumann wished them, no richer. The conductor's duty, therefore, is to balance his orchestra in such a way that everything is heard in proportion, rather than to rewrite Schumann's score in order to attain an effect Schumann never intended. Now let's look at the symphony itself and see what Schumann has done. The first movement begins with a strange and moving introduction that is remarkable on several counts. First of all, the initial motive is proclaimed softly by the brass alone, against a quietly moving texture of strings. In this opening passage, Schumann has already made a significant contribution to the history of orchestration by using the brass instruments for his main singing line. True, this line is rather in the nature of a trumpet call, or one might say even a bugle call. But because it is uttered in so soft and solemn a way, it acquires an amazingly lyrical quality, a feeling of quiet mystery, as though this were not just a trumpet call, but one that came from the furthest reaches of the universe. You see, up until Schumann's time, the brass department of the orchestra had been used in a minimal way to strengthen loud or percussive chords, to give accents, or to act as the spine, so to speak, of the orchestra. But rarely had the brass been used for melodic purposes. After all, the strings were made for singing. They are born melodists. And the same is true of the various wind instruments, but not so the brass instruments with their excessive power and their restricted ranges and their biting attacks on notes. If you were writing a symphony and had invented a lyrical opening theme that you loved and were proud of, you'd undoubtedly prefer to entrust it to the cradling warmth of the violins or to the sweet penetrating clarity of an oboe or flute, rather than to the comparative clumsiness of the stentorian brass. How brave and fresh of Schumann, therefore, to have begun his second symphony with this unprecedented use of quiet brass. And not only does he have 2 trumpets articulating the call, but 2 horns as well. And what is really exceptional, a trombone to boot, singing away quietly in unison with the second trumpet. Again, Schumann has broken orchestral tradition, since the trombones had always been used most sparingly of all the brass instruments. In no symphony of Beethoven do they appear anywhere except in the final movement for a special climactic effect. And even at that, this is true of only 2 out of his 9 symphonies. But Schumann belonged to that glorious age of the new Romanticism, the early days of orchestral pioneering and expansion that followed hard upon the death of Beethoven in 1827. And so we can understand the temerity of opening a symphony with a singing trombone 100 years before Tommy Dorsey. I've dwelt at such length on the introduction to this first movement in order to build up material for argument against the old bromide that Schumann orchestrated only for strings. True, his orchestra, like most orchestras, is firmly founded on the string section, which is the most versatile, flexible, and easily handled part of the orchestra. And it is also true that he sometimes overworks his string players, as we shall see. But in the main, his interests lay in developing the orchestra to meet the demands of his music. And so we see that throughout this long introduction, the strings do not once take over the lead until the very last bars. Under the brass utterance, they provide a kind of thick, animated carpet of tone, warm, rich, and calm, on which the mysterious calls in the brass can stand, nobly outlined and radiant. Then the winds take over, having had little or nothing to do so far. 4 bars of exquisitely orchestrated singing by the full woodwind choir. And as they continue, they join the string texture already established at the beginning to form even a richer carpeting for the re-entrance of the brass motive. And now those same winds become agitated with the timpani aiding and abetting them, but the strings are still in a subordinate role. Against this increasing agitation, the brass call is sounded for the 3rd time and developed. Who can say now that Schumann is a slave to the strings? A less academic treatment of the orchestra in classical terms would be hard to find. Unacademic, too, is the bridge from this introduction to the allegro proper. It's a gradual acceleration by the violins, who dominate for the first time, from a slow tempo to the main fast one. Notice how Schumannesque this is, with the almost neurotic accents in unexpected places and the tense harmonies. And so we have arrived at the allegro section, or the main body of the first movement, through an introduction of tremendous originality and orchestral power. Now matters change a bit, and here in the allegro we can find fault if we wish. Not only do the strings now play incessantly with only the very tiniest points of rest, but much of the time they are playing tremolo, that is, bowing very quickly up and down on the same note. which is, to say the least, tiring for the poor string player's arm. Let me show you what I mean. The main theme of the allegro goes like this. Schumann first states the theme simply, bowing one stroke to a note. But as the crescendo grows, he builds up power through the tremolo, so that each note of the tune gets several bow strokes. This is conventional string writing, if not piano writing, and is not only admissible but even advisable for purposes of generating more volume and continuous power. The only criticism here is that Schumann keeps doing it almost without let-up, so that it becomes tiring for the player. But that's unimportant compared to the fact that it does not become tiring for the listener. And the reason for this is Schumann's imaginative handling of the winds and brasses in such variety of combinations with the strings that the tremolos are made to sound constantly different. Listen, for example, to this transition passage where the winds are developing that agitated figuration from the introduction, and the tremolo strings reply in dialogue. Now here is one of those places where the conductor's job becomes important. If the orchestra is allowed to play at the volume prescribed by the score, the winds are not going to be heard in this important cadence. Because the strings, which are more numerous and powerful, will drown them out with their counterpoint. So a simple adjustment of balance is in order. It is the conductor's duty not to rewrite the score, but simply to have the strings play less loudly, still preserving the same rhythmic verve. Then the music will be heard clearly with strings and winds in true proportion. Now in the second theme, the strings are still going, mostly in double bow strokes as before, but now reinforced by the winds for a new orchestral effect. And again, those ecstatic, quasi-neurotic accents are coloring the music and the orchestration. This technique continues through the development section with the violinist's bow arms working overtime until a point where Schumann, like Beethoven in the Eroica, unconventionally introduces a new theme. And here the woodwinds take over, providing a much-needed rest for the strings, which now operate only as a kind of adornment. Beautiful music, and what beautiful scoring for orchestra. Nothing sensational like Scheherazade or the Bolero. There are no castanets or piccolos or tubas, only an orchestral treatment that is eminently just and fresh for this particular music. There's a really ravishing moment of scoring just before the recapitulation, where strong chords in strings and winds alternate with soft ones in the winds alone, as the harmony seesaws in the air. Did you hear that warm, romantic figuration of the cellos? That is a new orchestral wrinkle. It's a kind of active cello writing rarely found before Schumann. And when, toward the end of the movement, the brass utterance of the introduction intrudes itself triumphantly into the allegro texture, we are really in romantic territory. For here is one of the earliest uses of the cyclical form, that is, the plan wherein motives from the opening germinate throughout the symphony, recurring in odd places and linking the various movements thematically. This cyclical interest was begun by Beethoven in his Ninth Symphony, but Schumann was really the first symphonist to use it romantically for all it was worth, and it is to him that later composers like Franck and Tchaikovsky and Mahler owe a debt for their cyclical inspiration. And so what criticisms of Schumann's orchestration are we left with? Only one, that he wrote for strings in a way to tire the player. But of what importance is that when the essential beauty of the music is at stake? Difficulty of performance has never been, nor should it be, a criterion of worth. If that were true, no chorus would ever attempt to sing Beethoven's Ninth, which is murderous to sing, nor would any pianist ever play a Chopin sonata, which is exhausting to play. Schumann is also difficult to play, both for the orchestra and the conductor, but that is certainly no disparagement of his genius. In the marvelous scherzo which follows, the violin section is treated to a real test. It is a virtuoso piece of the first order, requiring great skill, accuracy, and endurance from every last violinist. And this, mind you, hard on the heels of a first movement in which the violin section has been given no quarter. It is merciless, but it is great music. The scherzo begins this way. Many critics dismiss this as unviolinistic. That is, they claim it is properly piano music, which has been given to the violins to play. The theory being that Schumann was basically a piano composer and that his orchestral works suffer thereby. This is simply untrue. Any pianist can testify that it is just as difficult to play on the piano. And again, difficulty of performance is no criterion. As the scherzo goes on and the violins climb to higher positions, it becomes even more difficult. But now it is becoming difficult also for the woodwinds and for the conductor. Did you notice that little slowing down at the end and the immediate picking up of tempo? Most difficult to do for all concerned, but what charm it has. There are two trios, or middle sections, in this movement, both contrastingly delicate and chamber music-ish in quality. The first trio makes a special use of the winds, again providing a resting point for the overworked strings. The second trio, however, uses the strings in a new way, sustained, lyrical, and intimate. And this is perhaps the most important point of all to be made about the performance of Schumann's orchestral music, that there are infinite ways in which the strings can be made to sound, and should be made to sound. For example, in this trio, by using only a very small portion of the bow and a very fast vibration of the left hand, a sonority can be produced which is so different from the string sounds previously heard in the symphony that it is almost like a different choir of instruments playing. That's the kind of variety Schumann needs, not a reorchestration in the style of Wagner. Listen and see if you can hear the sound of the strings change completely, as if to a choir of human voices. So Schumann's so-called overuse of strings is more than justified by the variety of ways in which he handles them. This beautiful passage we just heard achieves that degree of sweetness and intimacy because Schumann has treated the strings in the manner of a string quartet, omitting the double basses and writing the cellos in a high register. This, combined with the performing technique I described above, lends a new sound to the string body. The brilliance of this scherzo is unrivaled for its time, and the coda, with all the violins, firsts and seconds, joining in the final virtuoso fling, with, of course, the brass motive recalled from the introduction, capping the climax, has been known to bring audiences to their feet, clamoring for an immediate repetition of the whole movement. But perhaps the greatest beauty of this C major symphony is contained in the third movement, an adagio of such lyrical intensity that it stands alone among slow movements of its time. Again, the orchestration is simple, made to serve the music, but it is full of wonders even so. The soaring, tragic melody with which it begins is given to the violins, but there's a difference. It is played by all the violins, not only the first violins, leaving the pulsing accompaniment to be played only by the violas. This may seem at first like an imbalance, 34 violins playing the tune as against 12 violas accompanying it. But obviously Schumann wanted the maximum intensity of singing quality, or cantabile, and so he used all the violins he could lay his hands on. And with proper balancing by the conductor, it turns out that there is no problem of balance in the scoring at all. Now the romance is carried forward by the oboe, with the high bassoon escorting it like a lover. The strings join again with the winds. At this point, the strings drop out entirely, and the ensuing section is entrusted to two French horns, again sounding a mysterious, quiet fanfare, with the trumpets and woodwinds to strengthen them. Surely nobody can say that the strings are being overworked now. This mixture of brass and woodwind sound is one of the most original to be found in the symphonic repertory of the time. Again, listen to this use of the winds and the development of the first melody, and notice how the colors change as the line passes from one instrument to another, or from one combination to another. The four wind players have become almost an operatic quartet, conversing together in a lyric scene. Now the strings again, recalling that oddly personal fanfare, but in a great hush of wonderment. And again we can hear Schumann's distinctive way of writing very high notes for the cellos, so that it makes that intimate string quartet sound. Then comes what is surely one of the most ecstatic climaxes in music, as the melody soars to almost unattainable heights, resolving in a long descent of trills. And let's be aware that this great climax is achieved with the most modest forces: strings, horns, clarinets, and bassoons. That is all. A miracle of simple orchestration. And under these off-the-earth trills, the solo wind voices re-enter back to earth and sorrowful, and sing their extended cadence like a great prima donna executing her most exacting cadenza, free, meditative, pure song. How beautiful, how simple, and yet how original and moving a piece of orchestration it is. Of course, it is beautiful basically because Schumann's notes are beautiful. But as we said before, the orchestration so exactly carries out the meaning of the music that, simple and unsensational though it may be, it must be called beautiful orchestration. Schumann a bad orchestrator? I hardly think so. Even in the final movement, which has been the most severely criticized of all from this orchestral point of view, we find Schumann carrying out his intentions with the hand of a master. Again, there is balancing to be done by the conductor. There are those so-called pianistic passages for strings to play. There is almost continuous string writing, but all of these problems have been solved before and can be solved here as well. Again, difficulty of execution is no criterion for musical judgment. For example, the very opening of this movement, with its jubilant, energetic motives, presents the conductor with the danger of having his woodwinds obliterated by the brass. This is easily corrected by simply reducing the dynamic scale of the brass playing. In other words, the conductor asks them to play more softly. take this passage in the transition, which again requires virtuoso playing from the violins. But all that really means is that it takes a fine orchestra to play Schumann. And here comes the cyclical pattern again, recalling the romantic melody of the slow movement. But now it is embedded in a context of joy and power. After a long tutti development of these motives, we arrive at an extraordinary passage in which the slow movement theme we just heard is sung out upside down by the winds, as the strings support it with a passionately energetic accompaniment. Notice also in this passage how the high cellos are again heard, this time strengthening the wind sound, and also try to hear, if it isn't too much to assimilate all at once, the return in the brass of the opening trumpet call from the first movement. By listening for all three of these elements, you can see the orchestra as a three-part ensemble, embodying the string choir, the wind group, and the brasses. This is a perfect example of orchestration by choirs. Each choir has something special of its own to do. And if you can distinguish them, you are well on the way toward a greater understanding of orchestral procedure. In addition to all these clear beauties, Schumann has introduced some real orchestral novelties of a kind later to be used by all sorts of composers. For instance, when the oboe introduces the new material in the middle of the movement, a solo viola, only one viola, slips in to double the second phrase, and only this one phrase, an octave below. A truly original moment and a newly beautiful sound borrowed from the world of chamber music. Then an enormous coda is built up around this phrase, bringing the symphony to a close in a typically Schumannesque blend of energy and lyricism. It is quite unlike any other music. It is a kind of greatly magnified song. And the final touch of orchestral innovation comes at the very end when, of all things, the timpani is given a magnificent solo to play. This is a touch of modernity that should silence forever the charge of academicism in Schumann's orchestration. A magnificent symphony born of strength, mystery, and open-hearted lyricism. And all these qualities are enhanced by those same qualities in the orchestration. This is all we can ask of orchestration, that it faithfully report to us the music in its various essences, and that Schumann has done this entitles him to be cleared of that long-standing accusation of orchestral weakness. Schumann was a wonderful orchestrator.